When my grandmother passed away, she left me her house. A small but cozy place filled with memories of my childhood. It wasn't a mansion, but it was mine, and I cherished every inch of it. I moved in right after the paperwork was settled, grateful for the stability it provided. Then, without warning, my mother-in-law decided otherwise. One day, I came home to find my sister-in-law and her 2 children sitting in my living room, their suitcases stacked against the wall. Confused, I turned to my Emil, who stood there with an air of authority as if she had made some great decision for the family's benefit. "They need a place to stay," she announced, as if that explained everything. I frowned. "This is my house." She waved a dismissive hand. "They have nowhere else to go. You can find somewhere else. You don't have kids. You don't need all this space." I was stunned. My inheritance, my home, was suddenly being treated as if it was a communal property that she could redistribute at will. My sister-in-law didn't even look apologetic. In fact, she had already started unpacking, acting as if she belonged there. "Did you even think to ask me?" I demanded. My mother-in-law pursed her lips. "Family helps family. You're young, you'll manage." Anger bubbled inside me, but I knew that reasoning with her was pointless. She had already decided, and in her mind, my claim to the house didn't matter. But it mattered to me. This wasn't just a house, it was my security, my legacy. I took a deep breath. "You have until the weekend to move them out," I said firmly. She scoffed. "And if we don't?" I met her gaze unflinching. "Then I'll call the police for trespassing." A tense silence followed. My sister-in-law looked up, eyes wide with disbelief. My mother-in-law's face darkened, but I didn't back down. This was my home, and I wasn't about to let anyone take it from me. For once she realized she had pushed too far, and I wasn't playing by her rules anymore. The whole week after that was tense. My mother-in-law refused to speak to me directly, but she constantly tried to pressure me through my husband. She called him morning, noon, and night, complaining about my coldness and selfishness. She told every relative she could that I had thrown a poor mother and her children out onto the street, though no one even bothered to ask for my side of the story. My husband, while not agreeing with her methods, didn't want to take sides. "It's complicated," he kept saying whenever I asked if he would support me. But to me it wasn't complicated at all. This was my home, and I had no intention of backing down. Saturday came faster than expected. I woke up early, hoping to see that they had already packed their things and were ready to leave. But of course nothing like that had happened. My sister-in-law and her kids were calmly having breakfast in my kitchen, as if they had always lived there. Her suitcases remained untouched, and her daughter sat on my couch watching cartoons as if this was their home, not mine. I felt anger rise in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I gave them a few more hours. By noon nothing had changed. That's when I called the police. My mother-in-law was sure I was bluffing, until she heard me speaking to the dispatcher, explaining the situation. She shot up from her chair, rage flashing in her eyes. "You have betrayed the family," she screamed. "This is my home," I replied calmly. From that moment everything happened quickly. They started packing in a hurry, my sister-in-law looking defeated, her children staring at me in confusion, not understanding why they had to leave. I felt a mix of emotions. Anger, disappointment, but not an ounce of guilt. I did not feel bad for standing up for what was mine. By evening the house was quiet again. I walked through the rooms, taking in the mess they had left behind, and felt something close to relief. I knew my mother-in-law would never forgive me for this. She would paint me as the cruel, heartless villain of the family. But I didn't care anymore. I was home, and that was all that mattered. The silence in the house felt heavier than I expected. For days it had been filled with voices that didn't belong, with tension pressing against the walls. Now it was just me. The air felt still, but it was my stillness. I should have felt victorious, but instead there was only exhaustion. I spent the next few hours cleaning up. They had left dishes in the sink, crumbs on the floor, and a general sense of carelessness in every corner. As I scrubbed the counters, I thought about how easily my mother-in-law had dismissed me, how she had decided that my home was something she could rearrange to suit her own plans. It wasn't just about the house, it was about control. She had always seen me as someone who would yield, someone who would step aside for family. But not this time. Later that evening, my husband came home. He hesitated in the doorway, looking around as if expecting to still find his sister and her children inside. When he met my eyes, there was something unreadable in his expression. "They left," he said, more of a statement than a question. I nodded. "I gave them until today." He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Mom is furious. She says you've humiliated her. That you didn't even try to find another solution." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "What other solution? Let them stay forever? Move out of my own house?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he sat down, rubbing his temples. "I don't know. I just wish this hadn't turned into such a war." I folded my arms. "It became a war the moment she decided my inheritance wasn't mine." He sighed again but didn't argue. That, at least, was something. But I could tell he was torn. He loved his family, and now he was stuck between his mother and me. That was exactly where she wanted him. Conflicted, guilty, and more likely to take her side over time. Over the next few days, the phone calls didn't stop. My mother-in-law left angry voicemails, demanding that I apologize, that I reconsider, that I prove I was still part of the family. Relatives started messaging me, not outright condemning me, but subtly implying that I had gone too far. My sister-in-law, however, stayed silent. My husband and I barely spoke about it anymore. He didn't fight me on it, but he also didn't defend me when his mother ranted. That told me everything I needed to know. One evening, as I sat on the couch, staring at the blank TV screen, I realized something. It wasn't just my house I had fought for. It was my independence. My right to say no. And now that I had, I wasn't willing to go back to being the person who let other people decide what was best for me. I didn't just reclaim my home that day. I reclaimed myself. Days turned into weeks, and though the house was mine again, the battle wasn't over. My mother-in-law wasn't the type to let things go. And her resentment simmered beneath every interaction. When we saw her at family gatherings, she acted as if I didn't exist. If she spoke about me, it was always with a sigh, as if I had disappointed her in some unspeakable way. But the real strain wasn't with her. It was with my husband. He tried to pretend everything was normal, but I could feel the tension between us. It was in the way he hesitated before answering my questions, the way he looked away whenever his phone buzzed. Another message from his mother, no doubt. He never outright said I had done the wrong thing, but he didn't say I was right either. And that silence, that refusal to stand with me, hurt more than any words could. One evening, I finally confronted him. "Do you think I was wrong?" I asked, standing in the kitchen, my arms crossed. He looked up from his plate, startled. "What? Do you think I was wrong to make them leave?" He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's not about right or wrong. It's about family. Mom feels like you pushed them out without caring." I scoffed. I did care. I cared about the fact that it was my house. I cared about how no one even asked me before deciding I should just move out of my own home. He didn't answer. That silence was louder than anything he could have said. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, realizing something I had been trying to ignore. This wasn't just about the house anymore. This was about how we saw the world, about what we believed was fair. And the truth was, my husband and I didn't see things the same way. Days passed, and though he tried to pretend things were fine, I felt myself pulling away. I had always known his family came first for him, but I had assumed, naively perhaps, that I was part of that family too. That he would fight for me when it mattered. But now I knew the truth. One evening, after another tense, quiet dinner, I set my fork down and met his gaze. "I can't live like this." His expression tensed. "Like what?" "In a marriage where I have to fight to be heard. Where I have to fight just to have what's rightfully mine." I exhaled sharply. "I need a partner. Not someone who's waiting for me to apologize for defending myself." He looked away, his jaw tight. "So what are you saying?" I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I'm saying I need to think about what I really want. And if this is it." For the first time, real fear flickered in his eyes. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had already lost too much trying to please people who would never be satisfied. I wasn't going to lose myself, too. The next few days felt like walking on a frozen lake. The cracks just beneath the surface waiting to shatter. My husband and I barely spoke, and when we did, the words felt forced, careful, like we were both afraid of setting off a bomb. My mother-in-law, of course, was relentless. The moment she sensed something was wrong between us, she doubled down on her efforts. Passive-aggressive texts, guilt-tripping voicemails, even attempts to accidentally run into him after work. She wasn't trying to fix things, she was trying to break us further apart, to make sure he chose her side in the end. And I could see the effect it was having on him. One night, after another phone call from her that he took outside, as if I wouldn't notice, I finally spoke up. "You need to decide," I said when he walked back in, his face tense. "Are we a team, or am I always going to be second to her?" He looked exhausted. "It's not that simple." "It is," I said firmly. "Because I can't stay in a marriage where I constantly have to fight for my place." His shoulders sat. "I never wanted it to be like this. But it is. And the worst part? You're letting it happen." Silence stretched between us. He sat down at the table, rubbing his temples, but I didn't feel sorry for him. I had spent too long trying to accommodate everyone else's feelings. Now I was prioritizing mine. "I need to think," he finally admitted, and that was all I needed to hear, because I had already made my decision. The next morning I started packing a bag. Not because I was leaving for good, no, I wasn't going to walk away from the home I fought for. But I needed space. Space to clear my mind, to figure out if this marriage was something worth saving. When he saw me by the door, suitcase in hand, panic flickered across his face. "Where are you going?" "To stay with a friend," I said simply. "I need time to think." His throat bobbed. "And what if I ask you to stay?" I exhaled, gripping the handle tighter. "Then I need to know you're choosing me. Not just saying it, but proving it. Because I won't keep living in her shadow." For the first time I saw real fear in his eyes. Not just the fear of losing an argument, but the fear of losing me. I stepped out, closing the door behind me, knowing one thing for certain. No matter what happened next, I would never again let someone decide my worth for me. The days away from home felt strangely peaceful. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't walking on eggshells, waiting for another battle I never asked to fight. My friend Sarah welcomed me without question. She didn't push for details, just poured me a glass of wine and let me sit in silence until I was ready to talk. And when I finally did, the words spilled out like a dam had broken. "I feel like I've been fighting for so long," I admitted, staring at my untouched drink. "Not just for my house, but for my place in my own marriage. And I don't think I should have to fight this hard." Sarah sighed. "You shouldn't. Marriage isn't supposed to be a constant battle to prove you deserve respect." That hit me hard, because that was exactly what it had felt like. Not a partnership, but a test, one I was supposed to keep taking over and over, as if I had to earn the right to be heard, to be considered. I spent 3 nights at Sarah's, and in that time my phone never stopped buzzing. My husband sent messages, some pleading, some frustrated. He wanted to talk, but I wasn't sure what there was left to say. My mother-in-law also tried to reach me, though her messages were far less kind. She called me manipulative, selfish, accused me of ruining my husband's life. It almost made me laugh. As if she hadn't spent years twisting him into someone who put her before everything else. But on the 4th day, something unexpected happened. My husband showed up at Sarah's doorstep. I almost didn't open the door. But there was something in his face, something I hadn't seen in a long time. A kind of raw desperation that told me, for once, he wasn't just here to defend her. "I know I messed up," he said the moment I let him inside. His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't slept. "I know I should have stood by you. I should have told her no the second she tried to take over your house." I stayed quiet, waiting. He exhaled. "I let her control too much. Not just in this, but in everything. I see that now. And I don't want to lose you because of it." Something in my chest tightened. I wanted to believe him. But I also knew that words were easy. Promises were easy. What mattered was what came next. "I'm not coming back," I said slowly, watching his face pale. "Not yet. If we're going to fix this, I need to see that you mean it. That you're ready to put us first." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I'll prove it." I didn't know if he would. But for the first time I saw a glimpse of the man I had married. The one who once upon a time had fought for me instead of making me fight for myself. And for now, that was enough to take the next step. The next few weeks were a test, not just for him but for both of us. I didn't move back in right away. Instead, we took things one day at a time, meeting for coffee, having long conversations, slowly picking apart everything that had gone wrong. At first, I expected him to get defensive, to slip back into old habits, but to my surprise, he didn't. He listened. Really listened. And when he spoke, it wasn't with excuses, it was with understanding. I let my mother dictate too much of our lives, he admitted one evening over dinner. I thought keeping the peace was more important than standing up for you. I was wrong. Hearing him say that aloud felt like an invisible weight lifting from my chest. But words weren't enough. I needed to see change. And that's when he did something I never thought I'd witness. He set boundaries with his mother. One evening, he called her while I sat nearby listening. She started in immediately, ranting about how I had manipulated him, how I was tearing the family apart. But this time he didn't just sit there and take it. "Mom, stop," he said firmly. "This isn't up for discussion. My marriage comes first. And if you can't respect that, then we need space." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if she had hung up. But then she scoffed. "So you're choosing her over your own mother?" "I'm choosing my wife. Like I should have from the start." I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. For once she didn't win. Over the next few weeks I saw the effort he was making, not just in words but in actions. He didn't let her guilt trip him anymore. He stopped taking secret calls outside. He reassured me time and time again that I wasn't alone in this fight. And slowly I started to believe it. The day I finally walked back into our house, suitcase in hand, he was waiting at the door, eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in a long time. "Hope, I'm not the same man who let them walk over you," he said quietly. "And I won't be ever again." I stepped inside, feeling for the first time in forever that I was truly home. Not just in the house I had fought for, but in a marriage that maybe, just maybe, was finally worth fighting for. The first night back in the house felt surreal. Everything was where I had left it, yet it felt different, quieter, safer. For the first time it truly felt like my home. Not a battlefield where I had to fight for my place. My husband was careful, as if afraid to push too hard or say the wrong thing. He didn't shower me with grand gestures or empty promises. Instead, he did the little things that mattered. He made dinner, he asked about my day, he held my hand when we sat on the couch just to remind me he was there. But the real test came a week later. His mother called, and this time he didn't take the call in another room. He answered it in front of me, putting her on speaker. "I see she's moved back in," she said, her voice dripping with disapproval. "I suppose you're happy now, after everything she's put this family through." My stomach tightened, but I stayed silent, waiting. "Yes, I am," he answered simply. "And if you can't respect my wife, then don't expect me to entertain these conversations anymore." A sharp breath on the other end. "You're serious?" "Completely." She didn't shout, didn't cry. Just hung up without another word. But for the first time I didn't feel anxiety in the silence she left behind. I felt relief. He turned to me, searching my face. "Are you okay?" I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Yeah, I think I am." For the first time in a long time I believe we might actually have a chance. Days passed, then weeks, and slowly the weight of the past started to lift. We rebuilt. Not just our home but our trust. There were still moments of doubt, times when I had to remind myself that things were different now. But each time he proved that he was on my side. One evening, as we sat together watching the sun dip below the horizon, he squeezed my hand. "Thank you for giving me a chance to fix this," he said softly. I met his gaze and, for the first time, let myself truly believe in the future we were building. "Thank you for proving that I wasn't wrong too." And with that, we finally closed the chapter on the battle that almost tore us apart, only to come out stronger on the other side. Months passed, and life slowly found its rhythm again. The tension that had once ruled our home faded, replaced by something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. My husband and I weren't just coexisting anymore. We were growing together, learning how to communicate in ways we hadn't before. His mother, however, was a different story. She stayed distant at first, clearly furious that she no longer had the control she once wielded. She stopped calling as frequently, and when she did, she was short, almost cold. My husband didn't let it affect him, and for that I was grateful. Then one afternoon, she showed up at our door unannounced. I saw her through the window before she knocked, her arms crossed tightly, her face set in a deep scowl. My stomach tightened, but this time I wasn't afraid. I had nothing to prove to her. When I opened the door, she didn't wait for an invitation before stepping inside. "I want to talk to my son," she said sharply. I crossed my arms. "Then you can wait until he gets home. But you're not going to walk into my house and act like I don't exist." She blinked, clearly not expecting me to stand my ground so calmly. "This was never supposed to turn into a war," she muttered after a long silence. "Then maybe you shouldn't have treated my home like a hotel for your daughter." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "She needed help. And so did I countered. "But you never cared about that, did you?" For the first time, something shifted in her expression. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was just frustration. But she didn't argue. Instead, she sighed and rubbed her temples. "I don't like how things happened," she admitted. "But I don't want to lose my son over this." "Then respect our marriage," I said simply. "Respect me. That's all I've ever wanted." She didn't apologize. I never expected her to. But when my husband got home and she spoke to him, not at him, there was something different in her tone. Less authority. Less control. And for the first time I thought that maybe, just maybe, she was starting to understand. It wasn't a perfect ending. Never would be. But it was a new beginning. And for now that was enough. Months turned into years, and the life that was once filled with conflicts and tension started to take on new colors. Her relationship with her husband grew stronger. They learned to communicate openly, to listen to each other, and to address problems without sweeping them under the rug. But with her mother-in-law, there was still a lingering coldness. She no longer interfered as boldly as before, but her distance was palpable at every family gathering. She still hadn't admitted her mistakes and carried herself with a stubborn pride, as if waiting for her daughter-in-law to finally apologize for her defiance. One evening, as they sat on the porch, she carefully brought up the subject. "I don't want to live with this tension anymore," she admitted, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "But I also won't sacrifice my dignity. How do I find the balance?" He took her hand, gripping it firmly, as if afraid she might slip away again. "You don't have to apologize for standing up for yourself. You had every right to do so. But maybe it's time to try to understand her. Not forgive. Just understand." His words stayed with her for days. Eventually, she decided to take the first step. She invited her mother-in-law over for lunch. The older woman hesitated at first but agreed. Lunch was tense, the conversation limited to polite phrases and strained smiles. But at the end, when they were alone in the kitchen, she finally asked, "Why did you do it? Why did you think I should leave my own home?" Her mother-in-law looked genuinely surprised, then slowly sat down, letting out a long sigh. "I've always been used to being in control," she admitted quietly. "I lost my husband, and I was terrified of losing my son. I thought if I kept everyone close, I could control the situation. It was selfish, but at the time I didn't realize it. It was unexpected. For the first time, she saw not the domineering woman who had tried to take over her home, but a person with fears and vulnerabilities. They talked for a long time that day. It wasn't an instant reconciliation, but it was a step toward understanding. And this time, it felt real, not something done just to keep the peace. In the months that followed, things slowly began to shift. It wasn't a perfect transformation. Old habits die hard. And there were moments when the tension resurfaced, flickering like embers that refused to die out. But they were learning step by step how to navigate this new terrain. Her mother-in-law still carried herself with a guarded pride, but she no longer tried to control every situation. Their conversations were cautious but civil, and over time, they even managed to find common ground. It was strange, realizing that beneath all the power plays and stubbornness was a woman who had simply been afraid of losing her family. One afternoon, they found themselves alone together once more. The men were outside fixing the fence, and she was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when her mother-in-law walked in. For a moment, they stood in silence, the hum of the dishwasher filling the awkward gap. Then, breaking the tension, her mother-in-law spoke, her voice softer than usual. "You know, I didn't handle things well," she admitted, her eyes focused on the window instead of her daughter-in-law. "I thought I was protecting my family, But I see now that I was just trying to protect my control over them. She turned, her gaze finally meeting the younger woman's. I know I hurt you. And I know an apology won't fix everything. But I am sorry. The words hung in the air, heavy and vulnerable. It was the first time she had ever shown this level of humility, and it caught her daughter-in-law off guard. She had imagined this moment so many times, rehearsing sharp retorts and demands for justice. But now, standing there, she felt none of the anger she had carried for so long. Instead, she felt relief. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady. "That means more than you know. It didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the hurt or the damage that had been done. But it was a start. And for the first time, they weren't just tolerating each other. They were trying to understand one another." As the days went by, things began to change in small, subtle ways. Her mother-in-law started calling before visiting, no longer treating the house as her own territory. She began asking questions instead of making demands. And she even invited her daughter-in-law out for lunch, just the two of them. It was awkward, but it was also the first time they laughed together. Really laughed. It felt strange, almost surreal, like they were rewriting a story that had once been so bitter. Of course, not everything was perfect. There were still moments of tension, and the past couldn't be erased overnight. But they were building something new, something that was no longer based on control or resentment. It was fragile like glass, but it was real. One evening, as she sat on the porch with her husband, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she felt an unexpected sense of peace. "I never thought we'd get here," she admitted, leaning her head on his shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. "Me neither. But I'm glad we did." For the first time in a long time, she truly believed that they could move forward. Not just as a couple, but as a family. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't always be smooth. But they had made it through the storm, and they were still standing, and that she realized was enough. As time went on, the fragile peace between her and her mother-in-law continued to grow stronger. It wasn't without its challenges. There were still moments of tension, echoes of the past that sometimes resurfaced. But they were learning how to navigate those moments, how to communicate without falling into old patterns of control and resentment. Her husband was a crucial part of this journey. He no longer played the middleman, torn between his wife and his mother. Instead, he became a bridge, supporting his wife while maintaining a respectful but firm relationship with his mother. It wasn't easy, but he showed her every day that his loyalty was with her, that they were a team. One day they were invited to a family gathering. It was the first big event since everything had happened, and she felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach. Would the relatives still see her as the villain? Would her mother-in-law revert to her old ways in front of them? The evening started off tense, with relatives throwing cautious glances her way. But as the night went on, she was surprised to see her mother-in-law subtly redirecting any negative comments. When an aunt tried to bring up the incident of her sister-in-law being kicked out, her mother-in-law quickly shut it down. "That's in the past," she said firmly. "We've moved forward as a family, and that's all that matters." The room went silent for a moment, and then the conversation moved on. The topic dropped for good. Her husband squeezed her hand under the table, and she felt a wave of gratitude. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. After that night, she felt the last bit of tension leave her. The people who mattered most knew the truth, and for the first time, she felt accepted. Not just as her husband's wife, but as part of the family. Months turned into a year, and life continued its rhythm. Her mother-in-law even asked her for decorating advice one day, something she would never have done before. They were not best friends, but they were finally at peace. One afternoon, as she sat in her living room, sunlight streaming through the windows, she realized how much had changed. The house, once filled with conflict and uncertainty, now felt warm, safe, a true home. Her husband came in, carrying a box filled with old family photos. "Look what I found," he said, grinning. They sat together on the floor, sorting through pictures of his childhood, his parents' wedding, holidays from years gone by. She picked up a photo of his mother, much younger, laughing with his father. She looked happy, carefree. It was strange to see her like that, before the years had hardened her. "She was different back then," her husband said, his voice soft. "Losing my dad changed her. She got scared, scared of losing the rest of us. She understood then that grief can twist love into control, that fear can make people hold on too tightly. It didn't justify what his mother had done, but it explained it. An understanding brought peace. They framed a few of the photos and hung them up in the hallway, reminders of where they had come from and how far they had come. It was a symbol of healing, of acceptance, of moving forward. One evening, they had his mother over for dinner. As they sat together, laughing and sharing stories, she realized something that made her heart feel full. This was the family she had always wanted. Imperfect, messy, but real. After dinner, her mother-in-law pulled her aside. "Thank you for giving me another chance," she said quietly. "I know I didn't deserve it, but thank you." She smiled, her eyes warm. Family deserves second chances. And in that moment she meant it. The battle for her home had been more than just about walls and rooms. It was about claiming her place, her voice, her worth. It was about learning to stand up for herself, while finding compassion for those who had hurt her. It was about building a marriage based on respect and love, about transforming conflict into growth. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There would still be challenges, still be moments of frustration, but they were stronger now, wiser, ready to face whatever came next together. She looked around her house, the place that once felt invaded, violated. Now it was truly hers, not just because she had fought for it, but because she had made peace within its walls. She had reclaimed her home. She had reclaimed herself. And she was finally free.